In 1978, a Soviet pilot spotted a garden where map says only wolves live. 6 people had vanished into the mountain for over 40 years. They fled the modern world, but they forgot one thing. Is the wilderness the real killer, or is it us? You are standing on the skid of a MiL-8 helicopter, hovering 6,000 feet above the Sayan wilderness in 1978. Below, the wind screams through the Siberian pines, but something breaks the infinite green. A patch of jagged, cultivated earth. There are no roads for 250 miles, no radio signals, and the nearest human outpost is a ghost memory. The air smells of ozone and ancient pine resin as you spot the clearing. It is a vertical garden carved into a mountain so steep it defies physics. You see a shack built of graying timber, blending into the rock like a growth. There is no smoke from the chimney, only the terrifying stillness of a place that should not exist. In 1936, Lykov took his family and walked into the white silence of the Abakan Range to vanish. They carried less than 100 pounds of gear, a spinning wheel, several primitive Bibles, and 2 rusted iron pots. Their goal was total spiritual purity, but the reality was a 40-year descent into extreme deprivation. By 1961, the rye crop had failed under a June frost, and the temperature plummeted to minus 15 degrees. While the Soviet Union was launching men into orbit, the Lykovs were chewing on birch bark and leather shoes to survive the hollow hunger. Their ambition was eternal life, but nature demanded a viscous flow of sacrifice. The survival metrics found by the geological team tell a story of impossible engineering and fatal technical debt. For 4 decades, the family lived in a windowless hut where the floor was a mire of potato peelings and hemp dust. They had no salt, no matches, and their last metal needles had worn down to slivers of silver thread. Every sunrise was a tactical struggle against the minus 40-degree winters that bit through their homespun burlap rags. By the time the geologists landed, the Lykovs were using sharpened stones to harvest their meager grains. They had conquered the mountain, but they had forgotten the face of the world they left behind. When the geologists finally stepped into that dim, smoky interior, they found more than just hermits. They found a biological anomaly. The children spoke a language distorted by isolation, sounding like the rustle of dry leaves in a winter gale. They knew nothing of the Second World War, of television, or of the 6 billion people living beyond their horizon. But as the researchers offered the family a simple gift of salt and grain, a dark shadow began to fall. 3 of the children would be gone within 36 months of this first contact. The mystery remains. Was it the mountain that finally broke them, or was it the breath of the modern world? Leaving the world behind is a choice most people only dream of. But in 1936, Lykov made it a brutal reality. He gathered his family and walked away from the 20th century, heading toward the Abakan Range with nothing but what they could carry. There were no maps for where they were going, only the deep, silent taiga that swallows tracks and secrets alike. They weren't just fleeing a regime, they were stepping into a time machine. Look at the way they moved through the brush, heavy with iron pots and ancient Bibles. For the first few years, they were kings of their own desolate empire, mastering a terrain where the mercury routinely hits minus 40. They didn't just survive, they engineered a life out of the raw mountain. Using only hand-sharpened stones and primitive axes, they raised a windowless fortress against the wolves and the frost. Every joint in those logs was notched by hand, a testament to a human will that refuses to break. They were building a sanctuary, but as the years bled into decades, the sanctuary began to look more like a cage. Their technology was a forensic marvel of desperation. Hemp was grown, spun, and woven into burlap rags that offered the only shield against the Siberian wind. Without salt or modern vitamins, their bodies became biological clocks, ticking down with every meager harvest of rye. They replaced leather with birch bark, crafting footwear that left strange, skeletal prints in the snow. They were living in a loop of endless labor, where a single broken needle was a crisis that could last a decade. You can see the wear in the artifacts they left behind. The logistics of their isolation were flawless, and that was the trap. By 1945, the Lykovs had ceased to exist in any official record, becoming ghosts in the high-altitude mist. They grew their own food, made their own fire, and birthed children who had never seen a house made of brick or a piece of bread that wasn't gray. They had achieved the impossible, total independence, but nature was simply waiting for the first sign of weakness. They were kings of a mountain that was slowly, silently, preparing to take everything back. The triumph of their departure was fueled by an adrenaline that can last for years, but it cannot replace the chemistry of the human body. They ignored the technical debt of their environment, the lack of minerals, the narrowing gene pool, and the absolute vulnerability of their immune systems. They thought they had crossed the threshold to safety. They were wrong. The mountain doesn't negotiate. It only waits for your tools to dull. Look closely at the edge of this hand-ground stone knife. It's not just a tool, it's a countdown. The atmosphere in the Sayan Mountains doesn't just get cold. It becomes a predatory force. By 1961, the Lykovs' luck had finally run out, and the barometer was screaming. A freak frost in June, the kind that turns hope into brittle glass, leveled their entire crop of rye. For a family living on the edge of the world, this wasn't just a bad season. It was a sentence. The hollow hunger began to set in, creeping through the cracks of their log walls like a silent thief. Look at the frost patterns forming on this rusted iron pot. The metrics of their survival started to dive, and the rations were non-existent. Without salt to preserve meat or enough grain to last the winter, they were forced into a desperate gamble with the taiga. They ate grass. They ate the bark of young birches. They even gnawed on their own leather shoes, trying to trick their stomachs into forgetting the void. Akulina, the mother, watched her children fading and made the ultimate silent choice. She refused to eat, saving every scrap of seed for the others. Look at the jagged, uneven teeth marks on this piece of dried bark. The wind in the Abakan Range hits -40, and it doesn't care about your prayers. As the family huddled in the dark, the air inside the hut grew heavy with the smell of wood smoke and fading spirits. Their clothes, made of coarse hemp and burlap, were deteriorating under the constant strain of mountain labor. Every day was a forensic struggle to keep the fire from going out, because in this altitude, if the flame dies, you die with it. You can see the dark stains of soot and moisture on the ceiling of this cramped earthen dwelling. Their gear was failing them, and there was no one to call for repairs. The last of their metal needles had snapped, leaving them to stitch their rags with sharpened bone. The technical debt of 25 years of isolation was finally coming due. They were malnourished, weak, and entirely cut off from any hope of rescue. They were living in a loop of prayer and deprivation, waiting for a spring that felt like it would never come. Look at this hand-carved wooden spoon, worn down to a thin, translucent sliver by decades of scraping empty bowls. By the time the snow began to melt, the family had survived. But they were changed. They had seen the bottom of the world, and it was cold and indifferent. Akulina was gone, her remains resting under a pile of stones that the frost would never stop trying to heave back up. They had passed the first great trial of the wilderness, but the cost was a piece of their collective soul. The unease was growing, a ticking clock in the silence of the trees. Look at the shaky vertical lines carved into this birch bark calendar, marking the days since the last meal. The collapse didn't start with a storm. It started with a handshake. In 1978, the Lykovs finally met the modern world, and it was a biological ambush. The geologists brought salt, grain, and the invisible weight of 5 centuries of evolution. The family had survived the frost, but they had no armor against the common breath of a stranger. Their immune systems were blank slates, and the ink was about to be crimson. Look at this blurred 1978 photo of the first contact. By October 1981, the tragedy was in full swing, and the cabin became a morgue. The siblings began to cough, a dry, rattling sound that signaled the end of their 40-year streak. Savin was the first to fall, his kidneys shutting down after a lifetime of extreme deprivation. The law of the mountain had been harsh, but the law of biology was absolute. He faded into the silence of the timber while his father watched. Look at the jagged, frozen ground where the first stones were moved. Then came Natalia and Dmitry. 2 more lives claimed by a world they never asked to rejoin. Dmitry's death was a choice. He refused the geologist's medicine, choosing to perish in the purity of his faith. He was a master hunter, a man who could run barefoot through the snow, but he was powerless against a microscopic invader. The cabin was filled with the smell of wood smoke and the viscous flow of terminal illness. Look at the discarded empty medical kit left behind by the geologists. The disaster was total, and the survivors were left in a state of catatonic grief. In less than 3 months, the Lykov family had been liquidated from 6 members down to just 2. Karp and Agafia were left to bury the others in the iron-hard earth of December. No one was coming to save them because they had spent 40 years making sure they couldn't be found. The irony is a dark stain on the history of exploration. Look at the 3 fresh wooden crosses standing against the winter sky. This is where the pride of man ends, and the indifference of the Taiga takes over. They had fled the Antichrist and the bullets of the secret police, only to be undone by a simple virus and a handful of salt. The ordeal was not the 40 years of silence. It was the moment they let the world back in. They were frozen in a spiritual past, and the present was too toxic for them to breathe. Look at the final shaky entries in the geologist's logbook describing the last breath of Dmitry Lykov. The snow eventually covers the mistakes, but it can't bury the legacy of 42 years of isolation. When Karp Lykov finally closed his eyes in 1988, he left behind a world that had already moved on without him. The Soviet Union was crumbling, and the family's epic flight from the Antichrist had become a headline in a tabloid. They were survivors of the silence, but the cost of that silence was 3 generations of lost history. Look at the weathered silver-gray wood of the cabin door, hanging loosely on its hinges. The verdict of this expedition is written in the soil and the marrow, and it's a cynical lesson in pride. They chose to live as ghosts to save their souls, but they forgot that the human body is a fragile piece of machinery. By avoiding the world's sins, they also avoided its cures. And that was the ultimate tactical blunder. The youngest daughter, Agafia, remains as the final witness to this grand, doomed experiment. Look at the deep calloused lines on the palms of an elderly woman's hands as she holds a small, tarnished silver cross. Forensic analysis of the site reveals a terrifying level of technical debt. Decades of using tools until they were nothing but fragments. The Lykovs didn't just survive nature. They fought a war of attrition against entropy. Every year they stayed in the Taiga, the bridge back to civilization became more unstable. They weren't just fleeing a government. They were fleeing the very concept of progress. You can see the remnants of a hand-spun hemp rope, frayed and rotting into the dirt floor of the empty hut. The irony of the Lykov story is a viscous flow of religious conviction and biological reality, a clash where faith always loses to the virus. They survived the Great Purge and the Great Famine, only to be undone by a simple visitor's cough. The family remains are now just footnotes in a mountain range that doesn't remember their names. The mountain always wins, because it has more time than we do. Look at the 3 wooden crosses, now leaning at sharp angles as the permafrost shifts beneath them. We recover the journals and the prayer books to remind ourselves that the wild is not a sanctuary. It is a furnace. The Lykovs walked into the white and found a kind of peace, but it was the peace of the grave. Agafia still lives there, a lone figure in a landscape of shadows, guarding a history that most of the world has already forgotten. The journals don't lie. They tell us that human will is a powerful thing, but it is no match for the ICE. Look at the final, faded notch on a birch bark calendar, marking a day that no one else was watching.